I want to talk to you about ambition, especially given what I know about Christian Union. But I can almost never talk about anything without talking about St. Augustine. So I'm kind of smuggling in a second talk into this one talk, because here's what I want to talk about ambition, but I want to talk about ambition by illustrating a principle that I also hope you'll consider, which is, I think contemporary Christians should apprentice themselves to ancient friends. That is, I think it is really, really important for Christians in the 21st century to cultivate ancient friendships. And so I want to use this example of thinking about ambition with St. Augustine basically as an illustration for why I think the future of Christianity is ancient and why we have so much to learn from ancient friendships, why you should apprentice yourself to ancient friends. I think this is a good principle both for spiritual growth and professional creativity. In both ways, I want to encourage you to consider this, because what we're talking about is one of the things that should distinguish, I think, Christians in our professional spheres is that we run counter to some of the defaults of our cultural moment. And I would say some of the defaults of our cultural moment include a kind of chronological snobbery, I think is what C.S. Lewis called it. Chronological snobbery is this assumption that the newer is always better. And it's especially sort of woven into the worldview of a default progressivism that characterizes our day, which assumes that we are smarter than those who've gone before us. I actually think that gets us in a lot of trouble if we imagine that we are always smarter than those who have gone before us. And cultivating ancient friendships then turns out to be a way to tap into wisdom that our supposed enlightenment forgot. We are post-enlightenment, post-modern creatures, and in some ways we are still heirs of that modernism, which assumed that we figured everything out in the 17th and 18th century. Whereas, in fact, that might turn out to be a long detour from wisdom. So, by the way, Christians are not immune to chronological snobbery either. We have a tendency to always be sort of looking for the next big thing or the latest trend or the new formula that will finally secure spiritual success and do it for us. And so I think one of the reasons why looking back to ancient friendships is a good discipline is because it runs counter to some of our own vices in that regard too. Now, by the way, when I talk about ancient friendships, so I am trying to sell you on like the 4th and 5th centuries. However, in some ways, in a culture in which anything that was 5 minutes ago might as well be ancient history, in some ways, to apprentice yourself to a Dorothy Day or a Martin Luther King or a Howard Thurman is to make an ancient friend, right? To almost reacquaint yourself with anything pre-1960 is to become ancient. So I'm using this in a very stretched sense. And what I think goes on is the distance that these ancient friends have on our cultural moment gives contemporary Christians a sort of longer view of things. It helps us to zoom out a little bit from our immersion in the sort of 24-hour media cycle. And it helps us, I think, to discern what is perennial. What is perennial? What endures? What Russell Kirk used to call the permanent things. The challenges and frustrations that attend our human nature, for example, have not changed. the idolatries that characterize human nature have not changed. They morph into different forms, but the truths about humanity endure. And in that sense, the centuries can work like a sieve that helps us to sift out what really matters so that we can, again, tap into what I think is perennial. Don't you feel like sometimes the present is this blur, right? It's just this, everything is moving so fast and you get overwhelmed by the contemporary. the tyranny of the contemporary. And what I'm saying is, I think if Christians are going to have any countercultural purpose, we have to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of the contemporary. And I think one of the best ways to do that is apprentice ourselves to ancient friendships, because those ancient friends then become orienting. They become, they are a way to journey with sisters and brothers who have some distance on our cultural moment, and they function a bit like North Stars for us. It's another reason why, of course, we look back to the scriptures. But one of the encouraging things about finding these ancient friends throughout Christian history is you run into human beings who you can sympathize with and who empathize with where we find ourselves. The photographer Sally Mann has a memoir called Hold Still. And she quotes this line from her father's journal, where he's sort of asking himself a question. He says, "Do you know how a boatman faces one direction while rowing in the other?" So picture that for a second, right? Picture, this is classic old rowboat sort of thing. But if I'm this boatman in this rowboat, I'm rowing to get there, but I'm looking back. That is a very good posture for Christians who want to take the faith into the future. We are rowing into a future. We are called to be present to our cultural moment and called into the future. But if we are rowing and we have these sorts of stars, Christ is on the shore, and then we can see these other ancient friends that we are looking back to, I think that gives you a kind of, I'm going to mix metaphors. I was going to say it gives you an anchor. We're trying to row, so you don't want to anchor, but it gives you an orientation point to watch so that you can keep rowing straight. That's why I want to make this case for sort of apprenticing ourselves to ancient friends. I could talk about this for a long time, but the last thing I'll say is this. I also think it gives you a market advantage, so to speak. So I don't know, I think we're coming from an array of professions. In all of our professions, we are called to be smart, wise, and creative. I sincerely believe that people, Christians, who are tapping into pre-modern wisdom have deeper wells to draw from in the work that they are called to in the present. I think a Christian working in Silicon Valley who is both immersed in everything that's happening today, but also knows that there is perennial wisdom that existed before Steve Jobs, it actually has a creative advantage because their imagination has more capacity to imagine what God wants for the world. So I'm saying this is true for your spiritual life, but I also think it's true for your spiritual calling in your vocations to cultivate that kind of acquaintance with old friends. So I'm going to introduce you to one of my old friends, my homeboy. His name's St. Augustine. And the reason why I want to do that is, first of all, I want you to meet my best friend. Do you know what I mean? Like, who doesn't want to introduce their friends to their friends? And but also because I think Augustine is a very timely figure for us, but also because, and this is now, okay, this is where we meet you. So you guys are all powerful, important people. Augustine was you. I mean, he was a lot of the folks that you swim with here in Manhattan. And he has very specific psychological, theological insights into ambition that seem to me very timely. So that's what I want to set up for us this morning. Okay, all right. By the way, just a little bit of context in case I don't want to presume too much familiarity with Augustine. So for some of you, this will be a repeat, but for those who aren't. So St. Augustine is from the late 300s and early 400s. Okay, turned into one of the great doctors and teachers of the church, lived his life and carried out a lifelong ministry in North Africa, what would be today contemporary Algeria. Okay, what's interesting is that Augustine, on the one hand, lived at a time during the Roman Empire that might feel somewhat familiar to the moment in which we find ourselves, which was a very fractious, fragmented, polarized time. The barbarian horde are knocking at the door of the empire. Things are starting to crumble. There are a lot of anxious Christians because they thought Rome was the kingdom of God, So they get kind of nervous when they see this sort of imploding, and Augustine has to write and say, those were never the same thing, which is a very, very timely word. But what's interesting is Augustine is so contemporary for us, because what you have to appreciate is Augustine kind of grows up at this time in the 3rd and 4th century, 4th and 5th century. The North African provinces are sort of the outpost of the Roman Empire. So they're governed by Rome, but they're the provinces. Do you know what I mean? It's basically Roman flyover country kind of thing. And a lot of people in the provinces some people have deep aspirations to make it to the center of the empire. And Augustine, we're going to see, is somebody who has all of this ambition, all of these aspirations, but for the first 30 years of his life, they are for all the wrong reasons. He's kind of looking for love in all the wrong places. And so what becomes intriguing is Augustine lives this life of ambition for the first 30 years of his life, thinking that his ambition is going to satisfy his most fundamental longings. And then he finally becomes a Christian and has a pretty radical conversion. But that's when it gets interesting, I think, because it's not like he gives up ambition. So what does sanctified ambition look like? That's what we want to talk about this morning. Okay, sound good? So be scribbling your questions, because I'm really interested to talk to you about this. I want to introduce you to this guy who I think was kind of a Manhattanite 1,500 years before Manhattan existed. If you want to really know what Augustine was like, he's basically like a lot of people you hang out with. But before we do that, I do think we need to analyze what we mean by ambition. How many of you, if I say the word ambition, does that have a negative or a positive connotation for you? Both? Good. Okay. All right. We can go home. Because it is, I think ambition is a many-splendored but also much maligned thing. Your take on ambition depends on what demons you're trying to exercise. So if you are surrounded by prideful, power-hungry egomaniacs, welcome to New York, who are bent on making a name for themselves through Babylonian endeavors, we might say, well then ambition looks ugly and monstrous and domineering. But now let me give you a report from the Midwest. If you're surrounded by placid, passive, go with the flow, shucks folk who you see leaving gifts unused on the table and are really, in a sense, failing to respond to a divine call on their lives, well then actually ambition looks like faithfulness. Ambition looks like a kind of liberation. Ambition looks like almost the narrow way. Do you see the difference? The context matters a lot. So sometimes ambition is ugly, but sometimes the critique of ambition is uglier. So ambition isn't any one thing. It can't simply be celebrated or demonized. And this was captured really wonderfully. There's a recent collection of essays on ambition edited by Scott Cairns and Jeannie Murray Walker, both poets. There's a lot of poets in this collection. And at one point, Scott Cairns, who's a poet at Seattle Pacific University, he says this: either we are called to greatness or we are not called at all. I love that. What he's saying is, look, if I'm a poet, I want to be Dante. Either we are called to greatness or we are not called at all. But then what's interesting is other poets in the same collection talk about the shadow side of this aspiration. So Aaron McGraw says that ambition can carry us into terrible places, which I think we also have to recognize. Lucy Shaw, some of you might know Lucy Shaw's work, she says she has to ward off celebrity and fame, which are the bastard offsprings of unfettered ambition. And Emily Griffin warms about the goddess of fame that is in the ballpark of ambition, which seems very, very relevant. And by the way, seems also especially germane to our evangelical subcultures, which are also very susceptible to cults of celebrity. So if you keep walking around the phenomenon of ambition, you'll start to, I think, notice a couple of features, right? I want to delineate. The first is this. The opposite of ambition is not humility. This is really, really important. The opposite of ambition is not humility. It is sloth. It's passivity. It's timidity. It's complacency. See, some of us like to comfort ourselves by imagining that the ambitious are just de facto prideful and arrogant. Because if you do that, then what happens is that way, those of us who never risk anything, who never aspire, who never launch out into the deep, get to wear this moralizing mantle of humility. When in fact, we are just slothful or scared. It's often that cover of a false humility is often just thin cover for lack of courage. Playing it safe isn't humble. You can be ambitious and humble. You can also be playing it safe and arrogant. Because you might play it safe precisely because you don't want anybody to see you fail. That's pride, right? So arrogance and ambition are two very different things. The second feature of ambition that I just want us to appreciate is it is the telos of ambition that distinguishes good from bad. Telos is a Greek word for goal or end, okay? It's the goal or end, the telos of ambition that distinguishes good from bad ambition. It separates what I'm going to call faithful aspiration from self-serving aggrandizement. So Augustine, we're going to see, never stopped being ambitious. What changed was the target or the goal, the how of his striving. Here's the Augustinian question I want us meditating on this morning. What do I love when I long for achievement? What do I love? What do I want when I long for achievement? So let's journey into that question now with Augustine. I just think there's an exemplariness of how he wrestled with this. Now, Augustine drank in ambition with his mother's milk. If the scrappy provincial was hankering to make it in Carthage and then Rome, Carthage, so if you think of the North African coast, Augustine's born about 60 miles off the North African coast. Carthage is the sort of outpost city of the Roman Empire. So that's the first place that you aspire to. It's kind of Chicago, okay? Which, by the way, I just want to be on the record as saying, I think is the great American city. So if the scrappy provincial was hankering to make it in Carthage and then Rome, climbing the ladder of recognition all the way to Milan, actually in Augustine's lifetime, the seat of the Roman Emperor was in Milan at the time, not in Rome. It's in no small part because he was propelled by his parents. Like many before and after him, the map of Augustine's aspiration was drawn by his parents. His ambition was imposed by the expectation of parents with their own ambitions. So one of the only times you'll actually hear Augustine criticize his mother, Monica, is when he thinks back to why his parents sent him to school. Here's what he says in his Confessions. By the way, you should all have the Confessions and you should read it annually. I'm kidding, half kidding. So the Confessions is Augustine's sort of spiritual memoir, if you will, about this journey that we're talking about. And at one point in the Confessions, he says this: they, talking about his parents, gave no consideration for the use that I might make of the things they forced me to learn. The objective they had in view was merely to satisfy the appetite for wealth and glory. Though the appetite is insatiable, the wealth is in reality destitution of spirit, and the glory something to be ashamed of. For Augustine to be critical of his mom is a big deal. Now, that this endangered his soul was hardly anything that they worried about. In fact, he says, my family did not try to extricate me from my headlong course. The only concern was that I should learn to speak as effectively as possible. Basically, they were sending him to law school. so he could then go play in the halls of power. It reminds me a lot, actually, of, I don't know if any of you have read Andre Agassi's memoir called Open. It is even if you don't care a thing about tennis, it is an unbelievable book. And one of the things you learn about, some of you now are too young to know who Andre Agassi was. I'm getting so old. Andre Agassi was a great tennis star in the late 80s, early 90s. And what you learn in his memoir is that Andre Agassi hated tennis. Hated tennis. That's how the story opens. I hate tennis. But he played because it was his father's dream. And so in the same way, Augustine hates learning at the beginning, in no small part because it's his parents who are treating his learning so instrumentally for their own ladder climbing hopes. They're living vicariously through the son who has to endure it. And in fact, interestingly, we were just talking about Justo Gonzalez earlier. So Justo Gonzalez has this really interesting book called Mestizo Augustine, where he goes back and looks at Augustine for contemporary experience. And he sees in this aspect of Augustine's experience something that's very familiar to immigrant children, which is this kind of vicarious, imposed ambition. And what you see is, oh, Monica is the first tiger mom. Right? So Augustine is naming this in his experience. But, okay, so maybe the ambition begins as something that's imposed on him, but by the time Augustine gets to his 20s, he has owned it for himself. He says, I wanted to distinguish myself as an orator, a rhetor. That's why it's kind of a mix between, like, he half wants to be a lawyer kind of character, but he also wants to be the emperor's speechwriter. He wanted to be Michael Gerson, sort of thing, okay? I wanted to distinguish myself as an orator for a damnable and conceited purpose, namely delight in human vanity. That's why. Why do you want to do this? Because I want to be the one who's doing that. In his 20s, the chase is all him. He says, as a teacher of the arts they call liberal, he was really after something else. This is how he describes it. We, his sort of circle, pursued the empty glory of popularity, ambitious for the applause of the audience at the theater when entering for verse competitions to win a garland of mere grass. What are we looking for in our ambition? That's our question. What do we hope to find at the end of our aspirations? In Augustine's experience, like our own, I think, the answer is complicated. There are these bundles of hopes and hungers that are bound up with our ambitions, but so often I think they can boil down to the twin desire to win and to be noticed. So often our ambitions are reflections of a desire to win and to be noticed. Domination and attention. To win the crown, the garland, and to be seen doing it. Now, I grant that often our ambition can also be bound up with greed, but I actually think they're separable things, so I don't want to reduce them to because you can actually have these features of wanting to win and be noticed and not really care about money that much. So Augustine's map of this particular terrain of his own hungry heart is useful, I think, because so little has changed. When Augustine reflects on ambition, he's really, at this point, delving into the dynamics of fame, you might call it. Could anything be more contemporary, though? We live in an age in which everybody's famous, or trying to be. We have traded the hope of immortality with the hope of going viral. That is living forever. For Augustine, the only way to get at the root of this desire, though, is to understand it as a spiritual craving. That's why we can really only truly understand disordered ambition if we read it as a kind of idolatry. Now, I'm always a little bit hesitant to introduce that term so early because it sounds so judgy. And when I say idolatry, it's not like so much meant to be a finger pointing, it's a diagnostic tool. Okay? It's not about denunciation, it's about diagnosis. The point of discussing ambition in terms of idolatry is to understand that actually they manifest a spiritual hunger, This is a spiritual hunger that gets disordered. It gets diverted to different ends. So our idolatries, this is across the board. I think it's important for us to realize that our idolatries are less conscious decisions to believe something false and more like dispositions that we've learned and acquired, dispositions to hope in what will disappoint us. Do you see what I mean? That idolatries are less about false belief and more about disordered hope. And the problem with idolatry is not generally or overwhelmingly that we assent to the wrong ideas. It's that we entrust our things that will disappoint us. Our idolatries are really not that intellectual, they are affective. They are instances of disordered love and devotion. Think of it this way. Idolatry is more caught than taught. And we practice our way into our idolatries. They're kind of absorbed from the water in which we swim. So existentially, the problem with idolatry is, again, not just that it's incorrect belief, it's that idolatry is always going to be an exercise in futility. It's an exercise in futility. It's a penchant that ends in profound dissatisfaction and unhappiness. In that sense, you might say, the problem with idolatry is it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's trying to find satisfaction in something that could never stand up to the degree of our longing. That's why idolatry creates restless hearts. At the opening of Augustine's Confessions, he has this famous line in the prayer, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." Restlessness, interestingly, the German translation of that word there is angst. Our angst, our anxiety comes precisely because we're trying to find our end in all the other things except what our hearts are made for. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Ambition is an example of restless hearts looking for satisfaction anywhere and everywhere but the God who made us for himself. So another way that Augustine puts this is, in idolatry, he would say, we are enjoying what we're supposed to be using. For Augustine, the creation is given to us as a gift that God gives us to invite us to himself. And if you ever treat the creation as a substitute for the creator, you're trying to enjoy what you should be using to ultimately enjoy God. That's what's going on in our idolatries. We are treating as ultimate what is only penultimate. Or to put another way, we are heaping infinite, immortal expectations on created things that will pass away. We're settling on some aspect of the creation rather than being referred through it to the creator. So Augustine uses a journey metaphor to describe this. He says, that's a bit like you get in a boat to go to the other shore. Don't look, I don't want you distracted. You get in a boat to go to the other shore, and then you decide, this is a great boat. I love this boat. I never want to get out of this boat. This is a fantastic boat. I'm just going to stay in the boat. And Augustine says, well, that might work for a while, but the boat's not going to last forever. And you were made for another shore. And the dissatisfaction is going to set in. So what does it mean then to say that ambition can become a form of idolatry? What would that look like? What would it mean? Well, that's what happens when our ambition settles, as it were, for attention and domination. When we imagine that our goal is to be noticed or to win, we're actually lowering our sights in a way. Notice, what I'm saying is the problem is not being ambitious. The question is, what are we ambitious for? And what happens in idolatrous, disordered, ultimately disappointing ambition is I sort of lower my sights and I think, oh, what I'm actually looking for is to win and to be noticed. And you sort of settle for penultimate things rather than the ultimate things. We aim low. when we do that. The arc of our ambitions hugs the earth, and we expect to find fulfillment from people looking at us and beating everybody else in the competition for attention. And we think that's where we will find rest and joy and peace. But what happens when their attention turns away? Fleeting as it is. What happens after you get the grass garland, the medal, the scholarship, the promotion? How many likes is enough? How many followers will make you feel valued? What if we're not wired to be liked, but loved? And not by many, but by the one who made us. Could that explain why all of our attention seeking is never enough? Or the kind of, some of you are too young to have experienced this yet, so let me tell you, it's coming. I don't know any other way to explain it other than a kind of postpartum depression that sets in when you achieve exactly what you were aiming for. The depression that can set in after every win. Every time you make it to the top of what you thought was the mountain of achievement. And then you look around and you're like, oh, I thought it'd be better. I thought I'd feel satisfied. Why does winning make us still feel so restless? What am I looking for when I'm ambitious? What do I want when I want to achieve? Here's why I think we shouldn't be afraid of disappointment as a gateway to joy. Let me explain. So Augustine lives this very ambitious life and actually is making it. He is climbing. He keeps reaching up to every rung. He's got, by the way, he has incredible networks too. And so the networks first get him a job in Rome, and then those same networks finally get him a job in the imperial court in Milan. So he is living the dream. He is making it everywhere that he hoped to get. He gets to Milan. He's attained everything there, and that's precisely where he starts to be honest about his disappointment. It wasn't failure that unsettled Augustine. It was attainment that unsettled him. And Augustine's Milan, you have to realize, it's really not so different from contemporary New York or DC. It's really the place where people go to achieve and to be noticed. The cities of our ambition are perennial in that respect. And so Augustine comes to Milan with that sort of ambition. He says, here's how he puts it: I aspired to honors, money, and marriage. But you have to remember, back then, for a man, marriage was just another way to get money. Power, allegiances, alliances. He says, I came to Milan looking for all those things, and then he says to God, and you laughed at me. In those ambitions, I suffered the bitterest difficulties. And he was winning. And he says, that was your mercy. Don't be afraid of disappointment as a gateway to joy. He wasn't unhappy because he didn't make it. He was unhappy where he made it. And he was becoming less and less adept at pretending that he was happy. The real challenge here is I think people can pretend for a long time. They can sort of fake it because they know they're supposed to be happy when they achieve these things. So we can wear veneers for a long time. And part of God's grace to Augustine was actually punching through the veneer. This happens, I want to, there's so much to say. I do want to share one episode from Augustine's life. This is he's around 30 years old. He comes to Milan to achieve all these things. What ends up happening is he comes in the orbit of Bishop Ambrose. This is basically like somebody coming to New York to achieve everything, and somebody takes them to Redeemer Presbyterian, and they hear Tim Keller, okay? And they're like, oh, shoot, what's going on? And what happens is, so that starts birthing these different hungers in Augustine, these different unsettled, maybe new aspirations. And so his friends are friends to him precisely because they start telling him stories about people who have, not that weren't ambitious, but had different ambitions. And in fact, one of his friends named Pontitianus, he comes and he comes and visits Augustine and his friends in Milan, and he sees the letters of Paul's epistles sitting on the table. Augustine's a seeker at this point. And Pontitianus sees an opening. He says, oh, okay, you're not who I thought you were. There's something interesting going on. And so he tells Augustine a story about a friend of his named Marianus Victorinus, who was one of the great rhetors of early Roman culture, of Roman culture at this time, and actually had translated books that Augustine loved, and who had become a Christian. So Pontitianus tells Augustine this story about this really, really influential character who had become a Christian. And all of a sudden, Augustine has a different model to consider. And this is what he says afterwards. Suddenly, I was filled with holy love and sobering shame. Angry with himself, suddenly he was filled with holy love and sobering shame. Angry with himself, he turned his eyes on his friend and said to him, tell me, I beg of you, what do we hope to achieve with all of our labors? What is our aim in life? What is the motive of our service to the state? Can we hope for any higher office in the palace than to be friends of the emperor? And in that position, what is not fragile and full of dangers? How many hazards must one risk to attain a position of even greater danger? And when will we arrive there? Whereas, if I wish to become God's friend, in an instant I may become that now. So remember, this is some people who are friends of the emperor. And then they realize how fickle that friendship could be. And he starts to entertain, but there could be somebody who would be my friend who would never not be my friend. And that friend turns out to be my maker, my God. What is our aim in life? What are we aiming for when we aim our lives at some aspiration? Friends, the question isn't whether we aim our lives. Our existence is like an arrow on a taut string. It will be sent somewhere. It's not a matter of quelling ambition or of settling. I'm not commending that as if that were somehow more virtuous. It's not. You could say Jonah was trying not to be ambitious in that regard. The alternative to disordered ambition that ultimately disappoints is not holy lethargy or some pious passivity. It's recalibrated ambition that aspires for a different end and for different reasons. So what is the arc of a life whose aspiration is to be a friend of God? What difference would that make? Well, that is the only ambition that comes with security. It's the only ambition that comes with security, with a rest from the anxiety of every other ambition, because all other ambitions are fragile and fraught. The attention of others is fickle. Domination of others is always temporary. You can't win forever. Just ask Rocky. Attainment is a goddess who quickly turns a cold shoulder. But to aspire to friendship with God is an ambition for something you could never lose. To be a friend of God is to get attention now from someone who sees you and knows you and will never stop loving you. It's the opposite of a social media world. God is un-Facebook. Do you know what I mean? Because it's not conditional on what you exhibit or perform. And God's attention is not predicated on your performance. Some of you really need to hear this word this morning. And you've been Christians your whole lives. But I just want you to hear, God does not love you because of your performance. You don't have to catch God's notice with your display. He's not a father who you have to shock to jar his attention away from the football game. Some way of saying, look at me, look at me. He's a father whose attention is always on you, and you can rest in it. Augustine actually later in a sermon, he calls it being in the Father's lap. That's what friendship with God is like. You don't have to be worried about getting attention from anyone else. This is an attention that you can rest in. At the end of his memoir, Open, Andre Agassi recalls a scene before his last professional tennis match at the 2006 US Open, just across the water. The story's been one of imposed ambition and a lifetime of alienation from that father who forced him to play tennis. And now, on the eve of his retirement, he recalls this scene. I'm hobbling through the lobby of the Four Seasons the next morning when a man steps out of the shadows. He grabs my arm. Quit, he says. What? It's my father, or a ghost of my father. He looks ashen. He looks as if he hasn't slept in weeks. Pops? What are you talking about? Just quit. Go home. You did it. It's over. See, this is what worries me. I think our culture of ambition has two speeds: win or quit. But perhaps our ambition to win is a hunger to be noticed, maybe even a lifelong, unarticulated hunger to be noticed by a father and to hear him say, "Well done, you did it." Now, when you are loved by that friend, when you rest in that father, you don't quit. You can finally go out and perform. You think of it this way. He doesn't love you because you won. He doesn't love you because you won. You don't have to win, but you also don't have to quit. You only have to quit performing, quit imagining that his love is earned. You can rest, but that's not the same as quitting. You just need to change why you play. See, I think the revolution that Augustine experiences in his life is that resting in that Father's love releases him to finally aspire and be ambitious to use all of his gifts now out of gratitude, caught up in God's mission for the world. Not using my gifts so that God will notice me or so that others will notice me, but now because God has already loved me and sees me, knows everything about me, and will never stop being my friend, now I almost have like the safety net to be launched into a life of ambition that has completely different goals. Okay, you're gonna have to buy the book. I'll finish with this. Because there's just one last piece that I think is really important to learn from Augustine, and it's what I'm going to call his spiritual realism. His spiritual realism about ambition. What's really intriguing is, so Augustine's Confessions are, he's sort of this quasi-memoir where he's telling his past life. It's divided up into 13 books. The first 9 books of Augustine's life are the past. Okay, so in the first 9 books, he's narrating his past. In book 10, which is the real, I think, important book, he's actually talking about his present. At this point, he's already a priest and a bishop. He's a pastor. He's teaching other pastors. And what's really interesting then when you're reading book 10 is when Augustine's confessing his sins and vices, you have to remember, this is a bishop who's being honest about his continued struggles and brokenness. And it's precisely in book 10 that Augustine says, I'm still pretty ambitious, and it's not always rightly ordered. So what's really intriguing, I think, for us to think about is, he says, I grant that I am still kind of a sucker for the praise of men, so to speak. And that's idolatry. That's the fickle attention that characterized my disordered ambition. So he says, when I do well, I receive the praise of men. And I like it. And that's not good for my soul. So you would think, oh, well, how am I going to avoid that? Do poorly? Suck? Do badly? I mean, that would be one way to avoid that particular idolatry, is to just not do well. And Augustine says, no, that doesn't seem like the right solution. That's holy lethargy again. So he says, here's what I need to do. I need to basically be honest that I'm probably always going to struggle with this in this life. And that's why a life of confession is important for this life of ambition. And what I need to realize is, if you ask Augustine, am I doing this for God or me? The answer is yes. But you live into the grace and mercy and forgiveness of God by telling God that, by being honest about that. Still aspiring, still ambitious, still wanting to achieve and answer the callings of your office, realizing that that's going to come with its own risks, as it were, but you can't neglect that calling. You can't not use your gifts. Let me leave you with a prayer that Augustine prays in this context. This is what he says to the Lord. Be our glory. Let it be for your sake that we are loved. That is sanctified ambition. Be our glory, Lord. Let it be for your sake that we are loved. Amen? Amen. Great. Thank you.